So tonight we are going into Hebrews and James tonight. And reminder of our reading schedule tonight, we're doing Hebrews and James. And then next week we'll do 1st and 2nd Peter. And the week after that, we'll do 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So May 11th is 1st and 2nd Peter, May 18th, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And then May 25th will be Jude and Revelation. So before Memorial Day, we will have finished the Bible.
All right.
So we're going to stick to that schedule because I know this has been a 3-year process reading through the Bible. So, but Hebrews and James tonight. Any initial thoughts? Let's start with Hebrews and then we'll watch the Bible Project.
Well, I had 2 things that really jumped out at me. And the first one was in chapter 8, verse 13. In saying a new covenant, God declares the first one obsolete, and what has grown old and become obsolete is ready to disappear. And then we get into what the new covenant is all about, which is a really good reminder about faith and walking the faith path faithfully. And also in chapter 12, no, I guess it's 13, chapter 13, beginning with the first verse. I love these verses. Continue to love each other as sisters and brothers. Don't neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have entertained angels without knowing it. Keep in mind those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them, and be mindful of those who are being treated badly, since you know what they are enduring. And it goes on. And I just love that particular passage. It just really spoke to me. And I hadn't read that in quite a while. So I was uplifted by that.
Excellent. And the covenant piece is especially important as we're going through the Old Testament too, a reminder of how important covenant is. Your hair looks great, Camille.
I'm going to wear a kerchief next time. I swear I am.
But that covenant, covenant is one of the themes that drives us throughout the Bible and throughout all of the books. And so in this letter to the Hebrews is really pulls that together. Now it's called Hebrews and is written like as a letter to the Hebrews, but many scholars think that the likely audience was both Jewish and Gentiles for the audience of this, that it wasn't just a Jewish audience hearing this. There's also debates on, was this written by Paul? As like this, me saying this is probably getting old because we're saying it for a lot of letters. And there's some arguments. This is structured differently than the other letters. And you've probably noticed that in reading it. You don't have that greeting. You don't have the same like ending in the same way. You don't have those characteristic Paul ways of starting and ending a letter. One theory is that this book wasn't actually maybe a letter, but then maybe was a sermon that was being preached. And so that's another way that you could read this letter to the Hebrews, is not just as a letter, but as a sermon, especially because it doesn't begin like a letter, although it does end a little bit like one, but doesn't begin as one. Other things that popped out at you or that you really enjoyed about Hebrews?
Excuse me.
Go ahead, Helen.
I thought it described a lot about faith, having faith in healing, and also and peace and love, and it brings it into our lives. And I thought that it showed a lot and preached a lot on that. I mean, this letter
Yeah.
that he wrote. Faith brings all hope. I think they're looking pretty blind, bleak, and bad.
Yeah, I think that was reiterated strongly in chapter 11, starting with verse 1. Faith is the reality of all that is hoped for.
Right.
Faith is the proof of all that is unseen.
Right.
Because of faith, our ancestors were approved by God. And then they go through a bunch of examples
Right.
from the beginning.
That's a grab. That's what I got, really into. That I understood. That I understood. But not by faith, I would be here.
Yeah, it's really emphasizing that faith is not just something up in the air, but it's firmly grounded. And they're going through another imagery of this chapter 11 might be like the hall of faith. Like imagine you're walking down and you're seeing the cloud of witnesses, or walking through a hall with paintings about faith on either side, and walking through that. Yeah, and John pointed out, it points out a lot of practical messages, watching your tongue, etc.
Right.
Yeah, I like that.
It brings it home for people.
Yeah.
It's not a blind faith, nor is it an impractical faith. It's both practical and grounded.
And it brings hope. Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Any others? There's one piece in 11. They were stoned to death. This is 11 verse 37. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. And that sawn in two, there was a tradition that Isaiah was sawn in two by a wooden sword. And so that might be what that is referencing to. Yeah, they're really referencing, as John points out in chat, they're referencing pretty way back too. There's a number of references throughout here.
All the way back to Abel. Cain and Abel.
Yeah, really detailed as well. So it has kind of that sermon structure with that, with doing education at the same time.
Well, if it was one sermon, he sure was long-winded.
Well, if you're traveling around, you want to get it all out and out to everybody.
This is true. This is true.
Well, let's start to the Bible project, and then we'll see if there's any other thoughts after that. Let me let Toby's going to jump in here.
Great.
We'll let Toby join.
Hi, Toby.
We are actually.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and share. Let's go ahead and watch this video from Bible Project Hebrews.
The letter to the Hebrews. The author of this letter is anonymous, and people have wondered for a long time whether Paul wrote it or maybe one of his co-workers like Barnabas or Apollos, but really we just don't know. In chapter 2, we discover that the author had a first-hand relationship with the disciples who were themselves around Jesus, so we know that this letter is anchored in the teaching of the apostles. We also don't know who the audience of this letter was, or even where they lived. The author knows them really well, and he assumes that they have a thorough knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, especially the storyline of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, about how Abraham's family became the nation of Israel, about how Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they received the Torah and they made a covenant with God, where they built the tabernacle, where the priests offered sacrifices, and also about how they wandered through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. The author just expects that the readers know all of the details about these stories, and so most likely the audience is made up of Jewish Christians. That's where the name of the letter comes from. We also have clues from chapter 10 that this church community was facing persecution and even imprisonment because of their association with Jesus. Some in the community were walking away from Jesus and abandoning the faith altogether. And this explains the purpose and the structure of this letter. First, there's a short introduction, which is followed by 4 sections where the author compares and contrasts Jesus with key people and events from Israel's history. Jesus is first compared with angels in the Torah, second with Moses and the Promised Land, third with priests and Melchizedek, and lastly with the sacrifices and the covenant. And the author has 2 main goals in all of these contrasts. The first goal is to elevate Jesus as superior to anyone or anything else, showing that Jesus is worthy of all their trust and devotion. But his second goal is this: it's to challenge the readers to remain faithful to Jesus despite persecution. So in every section, he includes a strong warning not to abandon Jesus. So let's dive in now and see how this all unfolds. The elevation of Jesus begins in the opening sentence of the introduction. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors in many different ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. So the author's saying that Jesus is superior to all of the previous ways that God has revealed himself to Israel. He then makes this astounding claim that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's nature. These metaphors are making the closest possible identification between Jesus and God. So Jesus is what the rays of light are to the sun, or Jesus is what the wax impression is to the signet ring. For this author, there is no God apart from Jesus. Jesus is God become human as the Son. And it's this elevated view of Jesus that's then explored throughout the rest of the letter. In the first section, the author compares Jesus with angels, which might strike you as kind of odd, like why angels? In Jewish tradition, it was taught, based on Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, that the Torah and the words of God were delivered to Moses at Mount Sinai by angels. And so by saying that Jesus is superior to angels, the author is claiming that Jesus and his message of good news are superior to all previous messengers of God's word. And so the first warning flows from this very point. If Israel was called to pay attention to the Torah that was delivered by angels, how much more should we pay attention to the message that was announced by the Son of God? And not only that, given Jesus' status high above the angels, how remarkable is it that he gave up that high status to become human, to suffer, and to die? In Jesus, we see God's greatest glory and God's great humility as Jesus sympathetically joined himself to humanity's tragic fate. In chapters 3 and 4, the author moves on to argue that Jesus is superior to Moses, who led the people of Israel through the wilderness and built the tabernacle. Jesus is also the leader of God's people, but in him we see not the builder of just a tent, but of all creation. Then the author retells the story of how the Israelites rebelled against Moses in the wilderness, and they lost their chance to enter into the rest that God offered them in the promised land. And so here comes the second warning. If Jesus is greater than Moses, how much higher are the stakes if we rebel against him? We also are in a wilderness-like environment where we have to trust God for the future rest in God's new creation. So let's make sure that we don't rebel like Israel did in the wilderness and lose out on God's gracious offer to enter his new creation. In chapters 5 through 7, the author then compares Jesus with Israel's priests that come from the line of Aaron. Their role was to represent Israel before God and to offer sacrifices that atoned for or covered over the sins of the people. But, he points out, the priests were themselves morally flawed people, and so they constantly had to offer sacrifices for their own sins as well as for everybody else's. Something more was needed. And so he then argues that Jesus was that something more. He's the ultimate priest. But Jesus did not come from the line of Aaron. Rather, Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, that mysterious priest king from ancient Jerusalem, and he appears in the stories about Abraham. We also find in Psalm 110 that the Messianic king from the line of David will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the author's whole point is this. Jesus is the ultimate priest king. He's morally flawless, he's eternally available for his people, and so he's superior to any other mediator between God and humans. And thus comes his warning in this section. To reject Jesus is to reject one's best and only chance to be fully reconciled to God, so don't do that. Which transitions us into the last comparison in chapters 8 through 10. The author shows how Jesus' death on the cross was the ultimate sacrifice, superior to all the animal sacrifices offered in the temple. Those sacrifices had to be offered constantly, both daily but also yearly on the Day of Atonement. Jesus offered his life once and for all, and it was sufficient to cover the sins of the whole world. And so the author warns the audience from walking away from Jesus. It's like turning your back on a gracious offer of God's forgiveness. Why would you do that? Jesus' sacrifice is permanent, he says, and it's the foundation for the new covenant spoken of in the prophets, where all sins are forgiven. So now that the author has elevated Jesus through all of these contrasts, this final section is one big challenge to follow Jesus. So think big picture. In Jesus, they have found God's very word. In Jesus, they have hope for the new creation. Jesus is their eternal priest. He's the perfect sacrifice. And so now they should follow all the great models of faith found throughout the story of the scriptures, and they should remain faithful to Jesus, trusting that despite whatever hardship and persecution, God will not abandon his people. That's the basic flow of thought throughout the letter, which the author calls right here at the very end a brief word of exhortation. Here's a couple of extra tips for reading this letter. Whenever the author quotes from the Old Testament scriptures, which is like every other sentence, stop and go look up the reference and read that quotation in its original context. And sometimes you'll be puzzled, but more often you'll see all kinds of extra cool connections that you would never notice otherwise. It's totally worth the effort. You should also just know that these warning passages, they're going to make you uncomfortable, and that's kind of the point. They're not there to make you afraid. They're there to show you that rejecting Jesus is foolish because he's so awesome. These warnings all serve the larger purpose of the letter, to show that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy. And that's what the letter of the Hebrews is all about.
Mm-hmm.
I am going to leave because I'm catching only half of what's going on here. And the other half, it sounds like tin cans. So I'll watch for the recording of it, okay?
Sounds good, Louise.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Have a good evening. I'll be
You
in
too.
touch, Camille. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Any thoughts after watching that?
Yeah, they do have some pretty scary things in here. And I know they definitely said, okay, just because you're going to be persecuted is no reason to not keep the faith, because you have a greater reward coming. And just because you are persecuted, don't lose your faith. But yeah, some of it is a little alarming. I guess if I were hearing this, even if I were just indoctrinated into this brand new Christian faith, that would upset me a little bit. That would definitely upset me a little bit. And I think that is identified in chapter 12. Let us run with perseverance the race laid out for us. Let us not lose sight of Jesus, who leads us in our faith and brings it to perfection. And then it goes into struggles against sin. You haven't resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Encouraging words. When our God corrects you, don't treat it lightly and don't get discouraged when you are reprimanded. For God disciplines the ones God loves and punishes all whom God acknowledges as daughters and sons. So endure your trials. Da, 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 da.
Yeah, throughout history, it would have been, this was a dangerous act, though, too, to follow these lessons. We heard in Acts where they were saying in the temple, don't even say the name of Jesus. We've been hearing about persecution and allusions to the persecution that they've been receiving. And coming from our perspective, where we live in a place where being a Christian is widely accepted and even kind of popularized too. And so some of these warnings might sound harsher to us than, and for them may have sounded more like a reality check. And so there's a little bit of a different way. I appreciate it in the Bible Project reminding us it's not meant to scare people away, but is meant to tell this is reality, and being honest with people rather than trying to hide that.
But it also shows the endurance of the story and the religion, because it did succeed through all of this, because this did go on,
right?
And people, and so it does show, to me, it shows that this is, this was so good that nothing could stop it. A lot of people died for this.
Yep.
Yes.
People were tortured.
Right.
I don't know that we say that enough in churches. It's like this just started and it was just a lovely thing, and it like it is now. And maybe people should learn more about how difficult it was to get to this place.
Right.
Well, that's about almost any struggle, though. I mean, think of the Civil War, brother against brother, father against son. It must have been terribly difficult to go through that and come out a strong nation. I think sometimes you got to walk over those hot coals in order to enjoy not being in the hot coals anymore.
Isn't that how faith is tested?
Yeah, I have a problem though around that, because I think sometimes we tend to go backwards, and we're thinking if anything bad happens to us, it's because God is displeased with us or is testing us or whatever. And I just don't see that anymore. I just see us as having free will, and sometimes things in the environment or whatever can cause people either discomfort or dis-ease. And I just think God is there in all of it to support us. I forget to say, don't complain because it's raining. Learn how to dance in the rain.
Right.
Well,
when I get
what, Toby?
I was going to say, the thing is, I never knew this. This is the first I understood that there was any problem with, Christianity after Christ. you know, and I was brought up Lutheran, and after you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts of the Apostle, that's it. That's the New Testament. And you just kind of don't, oh, maybe read Revelations, but you know, that's it. I didn't know that this was a religion that had to go through this kind of trial. I had no idea that this makes me, it's sad, but it means that this really went through a lot. And I didn't know that. I thought it was just all, oh yeah, you know, Christ came, died on the cross, and we had the religion, and it was wonderful.
Well, I think the Christian path was tolerated to a point. I mean, I'm sure that the disciples at one point were speaking in synagogues until the movement started to gain some oomph behind it, and then they were kicked out, and then they were really, really under suspicion, because I think the hierarchy really figured with Jesus gone, it's going to die of its own weight. You know, we'll get his followers, we'll slaughter them too, and everything will be just fine. But it didn't work out that way. It just
you don't hear about that.
Yeah, I know you don't hear about that.
Yeah. Maybe we should.
And it's not just the struggles that they went through as Christianity was being formed, but also if you think back, we've been studying since Genesis and the struggles that the people went through throughout this, going through times of slavery, going through the Babylonian exile, going through that Christianity is part of all of that story in this struggle of how do we be in covenant with God. And it's such a long and so many struggles.
But I just think we take, maybe I should just I've taken it for granted. You know?
Sure. It's something many of us have grown up with. It's and some, even people who aren't Christian often have heard a bit about Christianity. And so we take it for granted.
Yes, we do. We do. And it's good to go over this. I mean, there's a great deal of wisdom in these books for us today, every single solitary one of them. Although there's a few things in Ephesians I'd leave out, and there's a few things there are more than a few things in Timothy I'd leave out.
I was thinking Timothy is the one that I've been talking about Timothy since last week to a few people.
Yeah.
Well, if these books weren't challenging, and if they didn't cause us to have questions, then they wouldn't have been included, because faith is about growing and learning. And so there should be challenges and questions should come up in our faith growth.
That's true. A lot of folks don't understand that we grow in faith every bit as much as we grow in our bodies and the maturing of our minds, that it is a process, and it never stops. It just never stops, or it shouldn't stop. I think people get into a big rut when they say, okay, this is what I believe in, and that's it. I don't want anybody telling me anything else, because I think Jesus is current. Jesus is just as current today as he was when he walked the earth, spreading this message of love and grace and peace, and be kind to one another. Don't judge riches just by material things. There's still foreign ideas to us today, to many people today, but I think it is a road of progress. We need to continue to be open to growth, spiritual growth. When I compare where I am today to when I was a child, just learning about Jesus and the church. Man, we're like continents apart, not just miles, but continents apart. And it's an exciting journey. If we look at it as an exciting journey, it adds a great deal to our spiritual life.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts on Hebrews? The second book we'll look at tonight is James. And this book takes its name from the history of it is that it's been associated with James, the brother of Jesus, who would become the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And so that's where we have this name coming from. James is the Jewish name is Jacob, as far as how those are connected. So we've got kind of James and Jacob. Jacob are interchangeable in these different languages. Any first thoughts on the book of James?
Chapter 2, where is it? Verse 14. My sisters and brothers, what good is it to profess faith without practicing it? Such faith has no power to save. If any are in need of clothes and have no food to live on, and one of you says to them, goodbye and good luck, stay warm and well fed, without giving them the bare necessity of life, then what good is this? So it is with faith. If good deeds don't go with it, faith is dead. James is saying, walk the walk of Christ and don't just talk about the walk of Christ. And I think he definitely expounds on that in a number of ways. He doesn't have very nice things to say about rich people.
Well, he doesn't have very nice things to say about a lot of people. He doesn't think too many people should be
true.
teachers or.
Yep. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
This is
What was James like?
What's that?
You know more history. Is there any? What was James like as a person?
I don't know.
I just wondered because there's quite a bit of negativity in it. So I just wondered what his personality was, if there was anybody that had.
Well,
it could also
go ahead.
It could also be frustration too.
Yeah, well, that would be too. Yeah. But then is it because they're going out and running into frustration as disciples? Is that where the frustration comes from?
Well, so they're starting this new church, and they're receiving pushback, but then also part of this is that for some of the letters we've heard in other letters too, is they're saying if you follow this, you will act differently. It's not that your works will like change you, but that the faith itself will transform you, and it'll be shown in what you are doing. But it seems to be that's not happening, that the people are still acting the way they were before.
Okay.
And James is like, I don't know how many times he's told them or how many times they've heard this message, but maybe they're not living as if they have faith. And faith should be. This is a line that sometimes people struggle with. Faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead.
Yeah.
So sometimes people
Mhm.
struggle with that because that works, that faith is not dependent upon works, which I don't think that's what this is saying, but that if you have faith, it will transform your life and you will do works, because how can you not? If you truly love God with everything you are, then you will use everything that you have to do the work of God, and that you will act in love towards your neighbors. And so it becomes more of a just an output. It's just the consequence of loving God is that you start to love others.
Yeah. Chapter 4, verses 4. You faithless people, don't you know that making the world your friend is making God your enemy? Those who want to befriend the world make themselves enemies of
Excuse
God.
me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hello? Midco is coming tomorrow. Sorry.
John pointed out, asked, wasn't James called camel knees? And that is a term that was sometimes associated with James. Another word, James the Just, is another word. It comes out of the traditions around James, outside of just the Bible, but the traditions that have circled around James. In that James, part of it, like when you pray on your knees, and if you do that regularly, your knees might start looking a little different.
I don't know that James was an immediate follower of Christ right off the bat, because I remember somewhere where Mary and one of his brothers came to get him, and Jesus asked, who is my mother, who is my brother? Those who are following me are my mother and brothers. So I think at some point in Jesus' ministry, his family thought he was nuts. So I'm not sure when James got on the bandwagon, and he might have been a latecomer, but definitely enthusiastic once he got there and embraced it. But he wanted to see people demonstrating the walk of Christ.
Yeah. Well, and why not? If he saw, it's hard for family, I think, to be on board right away. They carry a different set of expectations.
Right.
They carry a deep love. And sometimes that love comes with expectations too. And this desire of wanting the best for your loved ones sometimes can hold people back because they're afraid of what might happen. And what Jesus was doing during his life was not a safe path.
Right.
And somewhere James was transformed. Maybe it wasn't until, maybe it was before the resurrection, maybe it was after the resurrection. But seeing that and being a part of that story, and then he just threw himself completely
into it. Yeah.
Yeah, and moved, I think, his love for his brother over into that too, and it just grew even more.
It seems like when you read this that he at one time may not have even liked what was going on, and maybe had been against it, because it's almost like saying, look, this is where I was, now look, this is where I am now. I want to tell you, and I could see that if Jesus is his brother, and his brother has the attention and the following, and where does he, you know what I'm saying? Because it's almost like this is what I went through. You don't have to go through this.
Yeah. Some of the most powerful letters, we remember the story of Paul, where Paul before was persecuting early Christians. And so these are stories of people, not just mostly stories from people who weren't on board right away. And it is true that in the process of conversion, there is a different love for it, or a different type of devotion when you as an adult choose something versus when it's just always been a part of you. Maybe it's that you don't take it for granted anymore because you have actively gone through the struggles to believe that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
We
Can
ready
you
for
imagine what it must have been like to be the brother of Christ?
yeah, like, why don't you just be more like your brother? To have it be your older brother too.
Yeah.
You go through school.
Tough act.
Yeah. Jesus got all A's. Why aren't you?
I didn't think of that.
And maybe James was a little like, that's my big brother. I'm mad at him, but he's also my big brother. And I look up to him at the same time. I don't know. Well, we're ready.
It has got to hurt him a lot. You know what happens to Jesus and his brother. I mean, that's got to be very painful.
Yeah. To watch not only your teacher go through that, but to watch your brother go through that.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yep.
Yeah. And I think siblings hold a special connection. I think that when I've talked with people as loved ones have died, a spouse is a really difficult death. Another really difficult death is siblings, especially when it's one of your last siblings. But siblings know each other in ways that parents don't know their kids, and in ways spouses don't always know their spouse, because they've seen the whole progression throughout life.
Yep.
And so we have James here having walked through all of that. Are we ready for the Bible project?
Yeah.
Retelling of it?
Yeah.
So this is the Bible project on James.
The letter of James, or at least that's his name in English. If you look in the Greek, you will see that his name is Jacobos, which translates his Hebrew name Yaakov. And that's why most ancient and modern translations render his name as Jacob. That's what we're going to call him in this video. Now, there are many Jacobs in the New Testament. 2 of them belong to Jesus' inner circle of the 12 disciples, but this letter comes from the Jacob who was the half-brother of Jesus himself. Now, we learn this Jacob story from the book of Acts and from Paul's letters. After Peter moved on from Jerusalem to go start new churches, Jesus' half-brother Jacob rose to prominence as a leader in the mother church in Jerusalem. It was made up mostly of Messianic or Christian Jews. This was the first Christian community ever, and we know that it fell on hard times during the 20 years that Jacob was its leader. There was a famine that led to great poverty in the region, and these Messianic Jews were being persecuted by Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. But through it all, Jacob was known as a pillar of the Jerusalem church. He was also known as a peacemaker who led with wisdom and courage until he was tragically murdered. And in this book, we have the legacy of Jacob's teaching and wisdom condensed into a short and very powerful work. The book begins like a letter. He greets all the Messianic Jews who were living outside the land of Israel. But this does not read like one of Paul's letters where he addresses specific problems in one local church. Rather, this book is a summary of Jacob's sage wisdom for any and every community of Jesus' followers. And Jacob's goal isn't to teach new theological information. Rather, he wants to get in your business and challenge how you live. Jacob's wisdom has been heavily influenced by two sources. The first is Jesus' teaching about life in the kingdom of God, especially the Sermon on the Mount, which he's constantly echoing and quoting in the book. The second key influence is the biblical wisdom book of Proverbs, especially the poems in Proverbs 1 through 9. Jacob literally grew up with Jesus and with the book of Proverbs, and so now his own teaching sounds like them. It's stamped by their language and imagery. The book consists of short, challenging wisdom speeches that are full of metaphors and easy to memorize one-liners. And in essence, Jacob is calling the Messianic community to become truly wise by living according to Jesus' summary of the Torah, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. The body of the book is in chapters 2 through 5, which consist of 12 short teachings that call God's people to wholehearted devotion to the way of Jesus. And altogether, they don't develop one main idea in a linear way. Each teaching kind of stands alone and concludes with a catchy one-liner. But all of these teachings are connected through key repeated words and themes. It's really cool. At the opening of the book's body, there are two teachings. First, about favoritism and love. Jacob exposes how we tend to show favor to people who can benefit us, and we neglect people who can't, usually because they're needy. Jacob says this is the opposite of love, as Jesus defined it. He goes on to show what genuine faith does and does not look like. So if someone says that they have faith in God, but neglects people who are needy or poor, this person's faith is dead, he says. Their actions betray what they say they believe, and genuine faith always results in obedience to Jesus' teachings. Now, scattered throughout the body of the book, we find 3 different places where Jacob develops Jesus' own teaching about our words. So with the same mouth, we unleash pain upon people and then go offer praise to God. So messed up. And also, we judge people and then go talk badly about them behind their backs. And we also all tend to distort the truth to our own advantage. How we talk about people opens up a window into our hearts and our core values. Our words tell the real truth about our character. Jacob also believes that God's kingdom community, as Jesus taught about it, is the kind of place where the divisions created by wealth and social status are dismantled. So he warns first about the arrogance that wealth can create in people who believe it will be around forever. He says, no, your wealth will one day rot, just like you. In contrast, God's people are to live with patience and hope for Jesus' return to set all things right. And this should inspire a life of faith-filled prayer. Now, this part of the book, all of these teachings, they're so powerful, and there's way more than we have time for in this video. But seriously, read all of them and slowly. Now, placed in front of these 12 wise teachings is the Introductory Chapter. It's a flowing stream of wise teachings and one-liners, and they're designed to sum up the main ideas of the entire book. This chapter actually introduces you to all the key words and themes that you're going to meet in chapters 2 through 5. Jacob opens by saying that he knows from personal experience life is hard. He was martyred, after all, not long after writing this letter. But he believes that life's trials and hardships are actually paradoxical gifts that can produce endurance and shape our character. God can do amazing work inside of us in the midst of suffering and help us become perfect and complete. Now, that word perfect, it's really important for Jacob. He repeats it 7 times in the book. In biblical Hebrew and in Greek, this word refers to wholeness. It means living a completely integrated life where your actions are always consistent with the values and beliefs that you've received from Jesus. Jacob knows that most of us actually live as fractured people with big inconsistencies in our character. We are all more compromised than we want to admit. However, God is on a mission to restore fractured people to make them whole. And it begins with wisdom, the ability to see my hardships through a new perspective. God will generously give this kind of wisdom to people who ask for it in faith without doubting God's character. And when we realize our humble and frail place before God, we are forced to choose between anxiety or trust. And true wisdom means choosing to believe that God is good despite my circumstances. So if it's poverty that's forcing you into hard times in life, Jacob says, try and view it as a gift that forces you to trust in God alone. And besides, wealth is fleeting. It's all going to pass away like wildflowers in the summer heat. And so when we do fall into hard times, don't accuse God. Rather, let your circumstances teach you what Jesus taught about God's character, that the Father is generous, that he's there to meet us in our pain, and that he's trustworthy. It's this God who through Jesus has given us new birth to become new kinds of humans who can face their suffering with total trust in the Father, just like Jesus did. And this new humanity is something we discover when we not only listen to God's word, but do what it says. Jacob calls God's word here the perfect Torah of freedom. He's referring here to the greatest command of the Torah as passed on to us through Jesus, that he freed us to love God and love our neighbor. And Jacob shows practically what that kind of love looks like. It means speaking to others in a kind and loving way. It means serving the poor, and it means living with wholehearted devotion to God alone. Now you can see how this opening chapter contains all the key words and ideas explored more deeply in the 12 teachings of chapters 2 through 5. Jacob immersed himself in the wisdom of Jesus and of the Proverbs, and he's given us a great gift in this book of his own wisdom. This is a beautifully crafted punch in the gut for those who want to follow Jesus. And that is what the book of James, or Jacob, is all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good.
I thought he kind of summarized some of like Toby, your thoughts too, where this is like a punch in the gut book. A wisdom punch in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts with that on James?
Mm-mm.
The only thing I wondered, why is this never taught? In all the years I've gone to church and all the sermons and I don't remember anybody really kind of doing a sermon on this.
I think some of it is the book makes the most sense when you read the whole book.
Okay, that makes
And
sense. I gotcha.
so when you're
Yeah.
in worship, we have the lectionary and we're reading parts of it. And the lectionary is like crafted with the season and it's amazing how often the scriptures actually match what's going on in people's lives at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mhm.
also it's incredible how these scriptures line up as far as we usually have an Old Testament reading, we have a Psalm reading, we have a gospel reading, and an epistle reading, which is from these letters. But we don't read the whole book. So we have this little pericope, this section,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
pull something out of these letters. They're harder to preach on than it is to preach what is the book saying, rather than here's like a little section. I mean, it makes a lot more sense when you read the whole letter. It's meant to be read as one piece. Yeah, but it's harder to. We did do I guess we did the prophets. We did the minor prophets as a summer study one time. I guess we haven't done the letters as a summer study.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a lot in it too. There's some things that are harder to preach on and are better in conversation and in studies.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree with that.
Usually I think it's easier to do things in discussion. And I think that's it's helpful to hear people speak on scriptures to have new ideas, but
Mm-hmm.
it's really important to bring our own questions and discuss them too,
Mm-hmm.
because none of us are just sponges soaking everything up. We are also supposed to interact with these scriptures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we don't do it that much. That's the thing. We talk about things, but we don't.
Our Friday morning Bible studies at 8:30, which are available online, guys, are extremely interesting. We can talk about any and everything. They're very stimulating. So if you ever have a chance, join us on a Friday morning at 8:30.
How do you get on it, Camille?
It's either through the weekly update, or Donna sends out an email. If you tell Donna you want to be on the email, she'll include you.
Now you don't have to be present. This is online too.
Right. It's online. There are some of us that meet at church, but it is online also.
Okay.
It's
You
not
may
really-
not. You won't believe this. I'm intimidated by that group.
What? You're in you?
You
Yeah.
intimidated?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I that surprises me, Toby.
Well,
And
there
I really
are a
like it.
lot of men that are on it, or were at least, and it seemed like, it just seemed to be
Well,
difficult.
There's me, Mark,
This is Midco again.
me.
Hang on. Hello.
So Donna's the secretary then at the church?
Mhm.
Okay.
But there are several women who are a part of that. There's Dale Carmen, Marcia Patry. Jeannie used to come on. I think she's got a conflict right now.
Yes.
She plays the piano for us every once in a while. And I can't remember the gal's name, Louise or Laverne or something like that. But we have several different denominations who are a part of this Bible study, and we have a great deal of respect for where everybody is coming from. Everybody
It just
gets-
seems like you've been together for so long,
Oh, we've got new members coming all the while.
Oh,
John,
I didn't know.
is
I've got
a
the wrong opinion maybe of this group, that maybe I've
Yeah.
talked to some people, but I just,
yeah,
I really was intimidated by it. So
no, John Dines is a member of our Friday morning Bible study, and it just, I think it's terrific. I
well,
just
you'll
think
have to help me with it, Camille.
8:30, come online. Friday.
Yeah, I know, but I need to know what to read first.
It's
Oh,
the
read
scriptures
the
for
lectionary.
Sunday.
Yep, the lectionary for Sunday, for the following Sunday.
Okay.
And
I think Donna can send you the lectionary if
Okay.
you,
Yeah, that would be good. I don't exactly
Yeah.
know it, so.
yeah. So.
and you can find the
Oh, yeah.
lectionary online.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
I'll put
Do
the
you just,
link.
do you have it on the church website?
So, I don't really
No.
have the link on the church website, but if
No.
you type in Revised Common Lectionary in Google, you can find
Okay.
it.
Yeah.
But I also put a link. It's lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu,
Mhm,
and that'll take you to the lectionary as well.
mhm.
Would you send that to me, Gretchen?
Mhm.
Because I don't have anything to write with.
Mm-hmm. But I think you'd find it interesting, Toby. I really do.
Well, I'm sure I would. I have. I've just been intimidated. You've all been together so
Ellen?
long, and I thought,
Mary, you'd find it very interesting.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think you would have a lot to add too.
Yeah.
Especially having
Oh.
walked through these books of the Bible, looking at the
Yeah.
historical context and things. I think you would have a lot to add for people.
Mm-hmm. So it is an opportunity. So you can pick it up and run with it, or check it out and decide it's not for you. No biggie.
Oh, I get it.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep. Yep.
They put it on recording so you can watch it later.
It's not
No.
recorded. That's
No?
live only.
Live only, okay.
Not the 8:30 Bible study, the 8:30 Bible, oh, it's not recorded, but you can live stream it. Zoom it, you know.
Okay.
You can join on Zoom and do what John and Eunice do. They choose not to have video or microphone and just listen. You can do anything you want.
Well, wait, can I just do like we're doing here?
Sure.
That's what
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, is that it for tonight?
Thank you.
It is. So next week, May 11th will be our next class. Will be both online and in person, and 1st and 2nd Peter. So read through both of those letters, and we'll be back 6:30 next Wednesday.
Sounds good.
Thanks.